In the heart of Los Angeles stands White Memorial Hospital, a place of healing by day, but by night, whispers tell another story. For decades, staff have spoken in hushed voices about a hidden wing, doors sealed, lights permanently dark. They call it the Ghost Ward. Patients were once admitted there, but their names never reappeared in hospital records. Their voices, however, never left. Even today, workers refuse to set foot beyond that corridor once the sun goes down. Some say the ward is locked for safety. Others believe it was never truly closed. If you think you'd have the courage to walk those halls alone, subscribe right now. And if you wouldn't, at least share in the comments how far you'd make it before the darkness stopped you. White Memorial Hospital first opened its doors in the early 20th century. Born in a time of rapid expansion, it was hailed as a beacon of progress, a place where modern medicine could save lives in a growing city. Families brought their loved ones here with faith and hope. But alongside the promise of recovery, the hospital earned a reputation for something far less comforting. As the decades passed, whispers began to circulate among staff. A wing tucked deep within the building, one that seemed to vanish from official maps, was spoken of only in passing. They said it was shut down quietly, its rooms locked, its windows covered, and its hallways left in permanent shadow. The administration offered no explanation. And yet those who worked the night shift knew what they heard. They called it the Ghost Ward. The rest of the hospital thrived: new wings, bright waiting rooms, the hum of modern machines. But down a quiet corridor, beyond a heavy steel door, time stood still. Old fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering without reason. The air felt heavier there, as though the walls themselves resisted breath. On more than one occasion, gurneys abandoned in storage were found wheeled into the hallway, their metal wheels squealing faintly against the tiles. No one claimed responsibility. No one wanted to. And then came the stories that could not be ignored. A cry heard late at night when the floor was empty, a figure in a hospital gown glimpsed at the end of the corridor, only to vanish when approached. Records showed the ward was abandoned, yet something moved within it. So why was it sealed? And more importantly, what still lingers there? The first signs that something was wrong inside White Memorial's abandoned ward did not come in the form of grand events. They began quietly, subtle, almost too easy to dismiss. Night nurses reported unusual temperature drops in the corridor that led to the sealed doors. One moment, the air was still and warm. The next, an icy chill, sharp enough to see their breath. They learned to carry extra layers during their rounds, though they never lingered long enough to question why a single hallway could feel like winter when the rest of the building did not. Then came the sounds. Old call bells, systems that had been disconnected for decades, suddenly lit up, glowing faintly on the monitoring panels. A red light would flash, signaling a patient's request for help. But when staff hurried to check the room, they found it locked, the bed stripped bare, dust layered thick over the floor. It became such a common occurrence that some nurses began leaving the call bells alone, preferring silence to the thought of what they might find if they answered. Wheelchairs left in storage were often discovered in strange places by morning. Orderlies swore they had secured them, locked wheels pressed firmly into place. Yet by the next shift, the chairs were positioned in the middle of hallways, facing the sealed ward door, as if waiting for someone to climb in. The squeal of wheels against tile was sometimes heard during the small hours of the night, echoing faintly, though no one admitted to being there. One janitor, working a late shift in the 1980s, provided a testimony that the hospital administration later dismissed as delirium from exhaustion. He claimed he saw a woman in a pale hospital gown walk slowly into the closed ward. At first, he thought she was a patient who had wandered out of her room. He hurried after her, calling out. But when he reached the heavy steel door that sealed the ward, it was locked tight. The woman's figure had passed through without opening it. He refused to return to that floor again. When questioned, the hospital administrators denied every account. They insisted the corridor was unremarkable, the ward merely unsafe due to structural damage. Reports of lights, sounds, and moving objects were labeled as mistakes or exaggerations. But those who worked the night shift, those who heard the cries, those who felt the cold, knew better. The ward may have been sealed to the public, but to them, it was never silent. Her name was Maria, a young nurse, barely a year into her career at White Memorial Hospital. Fresh out of training, she was eager to prove herself. But eagerness, in a place like this, was dangerous. Older nurses warned her to avoid the corridor leading to the ghost ward. They told her it was a waste of time, that nothing good ever came from lingering there. Most simply refused to speak of it at all. But Maria was not like them. She believed the stories were exaggerated, tales designed to scare new staff, until the night she heard it for herself. She was finishing rounds on the second floor when it happened. A sound cut through the silence of the night shift. A cry, high-pitched, fragile, the unmistakable wail of a child in pain. At first, Maria froze. Children's cries were unmistakable in hospitals, but this was wrong. There were no pediatric patients assigned to that floor, and the sound, it came from behind the sealed steel doors of the abandoned ward. Maria's training told her to report it. Her instincts told her to act. Against the advice of her colleagues, she followed the sound. The closer she came to the heavy doors, the sharper the smell became, a stinging mix of disinfectant and something rancid beneath it, like chemicals failing to mask decay. Her shoes tapped softly against the tile, each step echoing too loudly in the silence, as if the corridor itself were listening. She placed her hand against the cold steel door. The cries faded, then stopped. The hallway grew so quiet that she could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above her, the faint drip of a leaking pipe somewhere in the distance. And then, footsteps, small, quick, hurried. They pattered just beyond the door, circling as though a child were running barefoot through the abandoned ward. Maria's pulse quickened. She pressed her ear to the metal and held her breath. That's when she saw it. A shadow, low to the ground, darting past the crack at the bottom of the door. The shadow of a child, where no child had lived for decades. Maria stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. She would later try to convince herself it was her imagination. But the truth was harder to deny. That night, the ghost ward answered her curiosity, and it would not be the last time. If you're still here, you're braver than most. Prove it. Subscribe right now. And if you've ever heard something in the dark that no one else believed, share your story in the comments. To understand what haunts White Memorial's ghost ward, you must go back to the 1960s. It was during those years that the hospital faced something it could not explain. A wave of patients began arriving with violent, unpredictable fits. Men and women, ordinary people with no history of illness, suddenly convulsing, thrashing, and lashing out with a strength that required multiple orderlies to restrain them. Their bodies bore no signs of disease. Their minds, however, were consumed by something far darker. Doctors noted the same phrase, repeated again and again. The patients claimed to hear voices, not whispers of paranoia or fevered muttering, but commanding voices. Voices that urged them to harm themselves. To strike at nurses, to leap from hospital beds as if pulled by invisible hands. Entire nights were spent with screams echoing through the ward, the kind of screams that rattled windows and left staff shaken long after their shifts had ended. And then, the fire. It began one summer night in Ward 8B, the very section that would later be sealed shut. No origin was ever found. Flames tore through the corridor with unnatural speed, devouring equipment, climbing walls, choking the air with smoke so thick it blinded those who tried to help. Witnesses swore they heard laughter within the roar of the blaze, though no explanation was ever offered. By morning, the ward was a ruin. No official record lists survivors. Those patients who had filled the beds the day before vanished from the files entirely. Their names, their histories, their very existence, scrubbed clean. Administrators quickly moved to cover the scandal. The hospital declared the wing structurally unsound, labeling it unsafe for use. They sealed the heavy doors and told the public that Ward 8B was simply no longer needed. Staff were ordered never to mention it. And yet, the stories refused to die. Nurses on the night shift swore they could still hear the cries of those lost patients drifting through the cracks in the walls. Some claimed the smell of smoke would return at random, years after the fire, seeping into the corridor without warning. Others insisted that if you pressed your ear against the door, you wouldn't hear silence at all. Because the walls there aren't silent, they hum. like something breathing through them. Years passed, but the sealed doors of Ward 8B refused to stay quiet. What began as whispers and shadows soon gave way to something more tangible, something that staff could no longer explain away as imagination. The first signs came from the records department. Doctors noticed that files related to the old ward began disappearing. Paper charts, meticulously stored in the archives, would simply vanish overnight. One clerk swore she locked them away, only to return in the morning to find empty drawers. At first, the hospital blamed human error, but when digital systems were introduced, the problem persisted. Electronic files corrupted, entire patient histories wiped from the system. Only the names remained, names with no details, no dates of birth, no record of treatment. As though the patients had never lived, yet could not be erased. Then came the equipment failures. Machines that worked flawlessly elsewhere in the hospital refused to function near the ward. Monitors froze, heart rate machines short-circuited, and IV pumps beeped erratically when wheeled too close to the steel doors. Engineers investigated, claiming faulty wiring. But one technician confided to a colleague that the electrical current itself seemed to distort in that hallway, bending in ways he had never seen before. He never returned to test it again. The most damning evidence, however, came from the cameras. Security had installed a new set of surveillance systems in the early 2000s, designed to cover every inch of the hospital. Most footage was ordinary: empty halls, quiet stations, patients resting. But on several occasions, the feed near Ward 8B captured something impossible. A woman, her gown stained dark with blood, standing just beyond the sealed doors. She did not move like a living person. She would flicker into frame, vanish for seconds, then reappear closer to the lens. Her face was obscured, her head tilting slowly as if listening for a voice only she could hear. One doctor assigned to review the footage collapsed after watching it. His colleagues found him pale and trembling, his hand clutching his chest as though he'd been struck. When pressed to explain, he whispered only one thing: that the woman on the screen had leaned close, and though her lips never moved, he heard his own name spoken clearly in his ear. By then, staff were refusing shifts that passed the sealed ward. A security guard, assigned to patrol the corridor one night, reported a sound that froze him in place. From the other side of the locked door came 3 slow knocks, steady, deliberate, as though someone or something was waiting to be let out. He dropped his flashlight, left his post, and never returned to night duty again. For Maria, the first encounter at the ghost ward was not the end, it was the beginning. She tried to convince herself that what she had seen, the shadow of a child slipping under the door, was a trick of her imagination. Fatigue, stress, anything but real. Yet the memory followed her into her sleep, and within days, curiosity became obsession. 1 week later, Maria returned. This time, she did not tell anyone where she was going. She waited until her shift was nearly over, the halls quiet, the hospital humming with the low rhythm of machines at rest. She carried only a small flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkened corridor. As she drew near the sealed doors of Ward 8B, the air shifted. Cold rushed against her skin like an open freezer, heavy enough to raise goosebumps across her arms. Her breath came out in faint, visible puffs, though the rest of the hospital remained warm. She raised the beam of her light across the walls. That's when she noticed them. Faint streaks staining the white paint, handprints, dozens of them, faded, smudged, layered one atop the other as if countless hands had pressed against the wall, clawing to get out. Some were small, like children, others larger, adult-sized, and all of them were positioned low, as though the people who left them had collapsed against the wall in desperation. Maria swallowed her fear and stepped closer. On a nearby cart, half buried under dust and scraps of paper, she saw something she was not supposed to find: a patient file. The folder was worn, edges brittle, the cover marked with the faded insignia of the hospital. She picked it up, brushing away dust, and froze when she read the date. The file was logged in the 1970s, years after the ward had been officially sealed. Hands trembling, she opened it. Inside were treatment notes written in rushed handwriting, describing violent fits and voices commanding harm. It was the same pattern from the 1960s patients, but one detail made her blood run cold. The name on the file was not a patient at all. It was a nurse who had vanished during the fire that gutted Ward 8B more than a decade earlier. Her disappearance had been quietly erased from the records. Officially, she never existed. Yet here was her name, her file, proof she had been alive long after the fire. Maria's flashlight flickered. For a moment, the beam dimmed, casting the corridor into near darkness. In that instant, she felt it, a presence standing just beyond the edge of her light, watching, waiting. What would you do if you found proof of someone who shouldn't exist? Would you walk away or keep reading? Comment your answer below. And if you know you'd keep going, hit subscribe, because the story of the ghost ward is only getting darker. In hospitals, rumors spread like infection. Most fade with time, but some, the kind tied to Ward 8B, cling like a shadow. Not every doctor was willing to dismiss them. Some carried secrets too heavy to keep forever. One surgeon, long retired, spoke privately to a colleague about what he believed really happened inside the ward. He claimed that during the height of the hospital's unexplained outbreak in the 1960s, Ward 8B was not simply a place for treatment. It was a place for testing. Patients were sedated, observed, and subjected to procedures never entered into official records. Strange drugs, experimental therapies, interventions that blurred the line between healing and torment. He said some patients were abandoned in locked rooms, left to writhe under the influence of voices no one else could hear. And when the fire tore through the ward, it was as though every unspeakable act had been sealed into the very walls. Those who believe the stories say the so-called ghosts are not restless souls at all. They are echoes, residues of suffering so intense it imprinted itself on the building itself. Every cry, every desperate breath, every unanswered plea, repeating forever. For Maria, the deeper she went, the harder it became to separate rumor from reality. After discovering the nurse's file, she began to hear things she could not explain. Walking past the sealed doors, she swore she heard her own name spoken softly, carried on a whisper so faint she could not tell if it was inside the ward or inside her head. At first she dismissed it, but then it happened again and again. The disturbing part was this. Maria had never told anyone she was assigned to that corridor. Her shift details were kept private. Yet the whispers called her name, as if the ward itself had learned who she was. Some of her colleagues warned her to stop going back. They told her, once the hospital has your name, it doesn't let go. Maria didn't listen, and soon the line between her reality and the ward's became dangerously thin. Maria's obsession with the ghost ward could not last without consequence. For weeks she pressed deeper, listening, watching, reading files she was never meant to find, until one night, she disappeared. The security logs from that shift are chilling in their simplicity. Timestamps show her key card activating the corridor door. The final entry records her passing into Ward 8B. But there is no record of her leaving. The doors never opened again. Her name remained frozen on the system as if she were still inside. Yet when a team searched the ward the next morning, they found nothing. No trace of her uniform, no flashlight, no body. At first, her absence was treated as abandonment. Whispers among staff suggested she had fled her post, overwhelmed by the stories. But then the voices began. Late at night, during quiet hours, her coworkers reported hearing Maria's voice crackle through the hospital's intercom system. Soft at first, distorted, calling their names in the same careful tone she used during rounds. The only problem, her radio had been deactivated. Her frequency had been dead since the night she vanished. It grew worse. A respiratory therapist swore he saw her figure reflected in the glass of an empty ICU room, standing behind him, though when he turned, no one was there. Another staff member claimed that during a late-night patrol, he glanced up at the windows of Ward 8B and froze. Behind the glass stood a silhouette. Female, still, watching. When asked to describe her, his voice shook. He said the figure's eyes glowed faintly, as though lit from within, unblinking and fixed directly on him. To this day, her name remains in the hospital system. Her shift assignments mysteriously reappear, even after being removed by administrators. Colleagues whisper that the ward claimed her, that she never left those halls, that she joined the others, trapped forever. Maria's disappearance was not the last story tied to the ghost ward. If anything, her absence marked the beginning of a new wave of accounts, each one more disturbing than the last. Several patients, ordinary admissions with nothing unusual in their charts, were mistakenly assigned to rooms near Ward 8B. When staff realized the error, they went to transfer them, but in more than one case, the patients were gone. Monitors flatlined, IV lines dangling empty, the beds left cold as if no one had ever been there. Their names remained in the system, frozen in limbo, like Maria's. No official explanation was ever given. Their families received carefully worded condolences, but behind closed doors, the staff whispered the same thing. Those patients had been taken. Among the employees, silence became survival. Those who admitted to seeing things, shadows, faces, figures behind glass, were warned to keep quiet. Rumors spread that anyone who reported a sighting would be dismissed for mental instability. Fear of losing their livelihood kept many mouths shut. But off-record, in hushed voices, nurses told stories of hearing footsteps behind them when they were alone, of gurneys moving on their own down the hall, of whispers rising from the vents at night. Perhaps the most unsettling account came from a priest. At the request of a desperate family, the hospital allowed him to perform a quiet blessing near the sealed ward. He stood in the corridor with his crucifix raised, reading prayers in a low voice. Witnesses said his words trembled as he spoke. Halfway through, his knees buckled. His face turned white. He gasped for air as though an invisible hand pressed against his chest. The Bible slipped from his grasp and fell open on the tile floor. He never returned to finish the rite. Days later, he refused to even step foot in the building again, telling those closest to him only one thing: something inside does not want to leave. If you made it this far, you're stronger than most. Don't just watch, subscribe now, because if you leave without doing it, maybe the next voice calling from the ward will be yours. The ghost ward of White Memorial isn't a story. It isn't just a rumor passed from one night nurse to another. It is a warning, a reminder that some places are not abandoned, no matter how many locks you place on their doors. To this day, the heavy steel entrance to Ward 8B remains sealed. Dust gathers on its hinges, warning signs hang crooked on the walls. Administrators insist the wing is closed for structural reasons, but those who have worked in its shadow know better. The ward breathes. At night, when the building quiets and the city beyond falls into restless sleep, a low vibration stirs behind those walls. Some call it a hum. Others say it's closer to a heartbeat, steady, patient, alive. Those who have been brave or foolish enough to linger by the doors tell the same story. If you stand close, if you stay longer than you should, the silence begins to bend, and then you hear it, a voice. Not just any voice, but your own name, spoken softly, as though someone on the other side is waiting for you to answer. And then there is Maria. Officially, she vanished years ago. Administrators marked her case closed, though never publicly. But deep in the hospital's shift roster, her name has a way of reappearing. Even after being deleted, even after files are wiped, the system restores her. Maria, assigned to Ward 8B, every time. So perhaps the real question isn't whether the ghost ward is haunted. The question is who it belongs to now. The patients who never left, the nurse who went missing, or the voices still waiting for someone new to answer their call. There is one final piece of evidence that lingers in the hospital archives. A fragment of security footage recorded late at night, years after Ward 8B was sealed. For most of the tape, the hallway is still, silent, empty. The same flickering light swaying above the door. But in the final seconds, something changes. The camera catches movement. The steel door, long rusted in place, shifts slowly. It creaks just wide enough for a sliver of darkness to spill through. Just enough space for someone, or something, to step out. The feed cuts abruptly after that. To this day, no one will say what happened in the minutes that followed. So now, the question is no longer about Maria, or the patients, or even the hospital itself. The question is you. Would you enter the ghost ward? Comment your answer below, and don't forget to subscribe, because if you walk away without doing it, maybe the next name the ward remembers will be yours.